Exodus chapter 6, starting at verse 28, going all the way to chapter 7, verse 2. It's about God's amazing preparation. That's Exodus chapter 6, starting at verse 28. And it came to pass on the day when the Lord spake unto Moses in the land of Egypt, that the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, I am the Lord. Stop there for a moment. Everything up to that point had been natural in the life of Moses. It was extraordinary, but it was all natural. By which I mean, he was raised in Pharaoh's household, killed an Egyptian, 40 years there, and then 40 years in the wilderness, tending sheep. And the natural, I suppose, it looked like, man, he made a big mistake. And he was 40 years in the wilderness, tending sheep, which weren't his own. 80 years old. Looks like, well, this is a full life. And then God appears. And something extraordinary happens. Something supernatural happens. He sees a tree burning and it's not consumed. And it comes to God saying, I am the Lord. It sounds simple enough. He didn't have to explain anything. The reason why God didn't have to explain is because when you really do encounter God, you know it's God. You know it's God because you can sense not only his complete righteousness, but you can also sense your complete unrighteousness. Everybody in the Bible who encounters him is fearful. Mm-hmm. It's a fear that comes from the fact that you know that God is righteous, you can feel his righteousness, and you absolutely are completely aware of your own unrighteousness. Your unworthiness to stand in the presence of God. He doesn't have to say anything more than, I am the Lord. It's like, yep, I know that for sure. When you encounter the real, it's easy to identify the counterfeit. And so he starts off very simply, he says, I am the Lord. It's like, okay, I know who I'm talking to. And then he says, this is not a suggestion. This isn't a question. He says, speak thou unto Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I say unto thee. Now, again, it sounds simple. Not so. First of all, Pharaoh didn't consider himself simply a king. He was worshipped also as a god. Now, as was in those days, and still is in some places today, you can't speak directly to a king because you're not noble. So they have what's called an interlocutor. You talk to that person, and then that person talks to the king. And then the king talks back to that person, and then they convey the message to you. They don't talk to common people. So here's God saying to Moses, who is common, speak unto Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I say unto thee. How's that supposed to happen? I can't talk directly with Pharaoh. You don't talk directly with someone who thinks he's not just king, but also a god. And so Moses said before the Lord, behold, I am of uncircumcised lips. Why is that? Well, because he had a stutter. He had a bad stutter. I suspect this is when this happened 40 years in the wilderness. Why? Because there's no mention of having a stutter in the court of Pharaoh's house. In the court of Pharaoh. I mean, he was with Pharaoh's household. It was like things were good. But after you run out of something like that and you're living with sheep, tending sheep all day and night, I suppose you could get a stutter, right? Mm-hmm. I'm of uncircumcised lips. He said, I got a stutter. And how shall Pharaoh hearken to me? Why would Pharaoh listen to me? I'm a sheep herder. And not only a commoner, but sheep herders were an abomination to the Egyptians. Like they were really filthy. They were like street hobos. It was like lower than low. So why is he going to listen to me? Chapter 7, verse 1. And the Lord said unto Moses, see, I have made thee a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet. Wait, hold the horses here. So I'm a sheep herder, but you've made me a god to Pharaoh. And my older brother Aaron, he's my prophet, is he? He answers Moses, but in a way that you can't understand. In the natural, you can't understand it. It doesn't make sense in the natural. Here's a sheep herder, he's going to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh, we're not going to use Pharaoh's interlocutor, we're going to use my interlocutor. Happens to be my older brother. Because I'm higher than Pharaoh, who calls himself a god. See, in the natural, it doesn't make any sense. That's why I said, up to this point, everything was natural. After he encounters God, after he speaks with God, everything is supernatural.
Amen.
Because none of this he can do on his own. There's not a part of it he could ever consider. All he's got to do is just kind of jump on the wagon and go for the ride. Because he can't do any of this. The only way he can be successful is by following the instructions. And Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet. And then he says, thou shalt speak all that I command thee. And Aaron thy brother shall speak unto Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of his land. So this is the mandate. This is your job. This is your job description. This is what I'm going to have you do. I'm sure Moses is thinking, but this is impossible. I can't do this. And he's absolutely right. He can't do this. But he recognized, he didn't make the mistake that the people made in the wilderness by saying, we can't take this land. We can't take, there's giants here. He didn't look at the problem, he looked at God. It's like, he's God, he must know what he's talking about. If he doesn't know what he's talking about, who knows what they're talking about, right? And so everything after this point, 80 years, all natural. 80 years, everything is like, makes total sense in a natural context. Yeah, he was in Pharaoh's court and he was kind of adopted. And okay, well, it's extraordinary, but it's still, you can understand that. And he killed an Egyptian, he got run out of town. Well, that's understandable. Ends up tending sheep. Well, I guess what else you're going to do? You're in the wilderness, you're going to tend sheep, right? Everything's natural until he encounters the supernatural. He encounters God. And then everything after that is completely different. Now, you got to ask yourself, so after 80 years, 40 years with Pharaoh, 40 years in the wilderness, what qualified him to speak to Pharaoh? What qualified him to be chosen by God to speak to Pharaoh? You see, we look at the natural and we say, well, you know, if I want to be a mechanic, I go to school, I get an apprenticeship, and I become a mechanic. Personally, I wanted to be involved in business. I got a master's degree in economics. Okay, you're working towards something. You want to be a hairstylist, you go to a hairstylist salon and you learn, and then it's a natural process. We all understand. But this was no natural process. You see, God was working in his situation and he didn't even know it. He understood everything in a natural context. He might have regretted some things that happened, but he still lived the life. Got a wife, a couple of boys, and it's like, it's life. It's life, he's experiencing life. And at 80 years old, he encounters God. And starts a whole new life. The point is, he was living what he considered just a natural life, not knowing that God was working in his life, changing him, transforming him, renewing him, setting him up for what he had no idea, to the point he encountered God, and then the extraordinary just started to happen. What made Moses different than everybody else? Nothing. He was just Joe Normal. Except that there was something inside of him that God saw that nobody else saw that qualified him. Something God put there in the first place. The day he was born, probably. And then God cultured that, nurtured that through his natural circumstances to enable him just simply to be able to hear God and trust God. So God gave him a leadership ability, and he gave him, or developed in him, the thing that was most important, just being able to trust and believe God. And with just that, God saved the whole people. Like 2 million people led out of Egypt. Just a pile of people. And it was one man. So why is that important? It's important because you could be another Moses. Doesn't matter, male, female, colored, race, culture. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. You have something that God put in you. Do you know what that is? Are you letting God work with it? Because once you encounter God, you're going to see supernatural things happen. It's not going to be what I can do after that. It's about what God can do through you. And you'll look with amazement, because what he does through you is way bigger than you could ever even think about what he's going to do. That's what this message is about. God put something in you. Do you know what it is? Have you encountered God? Because when you have encountered God, then the supernatural happens. He uses you in a supernatural way. It's not about you at all. It's just letting God work through you. That's a remarkable thing. Yes, you are special. You are special. You're chosen by God. You're here today because God called you. Don't give him half the loaf. Give him everything. Get with the supernatural program. It's a whole lot better than the natural one. His 40 years, I'm sure that the 40 years that he had in the wilderness, even though it was a tough haul, was way better than the first 80. Are you ready? Because if you are, he's ready to encounter you. Just got to trust him, just got to believe him. And that's the message for today.